25 years ago, when I wrote this poem, had someone said it would still have resonance today, I would have thought they were hapless, hopeless, or just a white supremacist. I certainly wouldn't have believed that it was true that I would still begin a poem that began, "You enter from a door across the room, steady walk, Caribbean confidence, and just a hint of an 80s bop. Your smile parading ahead of you like a victorious soldier is a lie. There's no reason to smile here in the land of confiscated dreams, plastic plants, state issue clothes, roaches, abuse, and black men. I rise to meet you, hold you, and we lock perfectly together like found pieces of a lost puzzle. We stand like this for 45 seconds, but no longer. Longer may mean the police will come over or yell on the PA system. No extended embraces. Extended embraces are a violation. Residents will be written up. You run your hands through my hair, ask me perfunctory questions. How was the ride up? You sleep okay last night? Can we get business out the way? Still love me, baby? I never sleep the nights before I come to see you. All these years later, I still can't relax. I read, watch television, fantasize, but at 3 o'clock, I'm still wide awake, waiting for the alarm. 4:15 in the a.m., it'll beep, and I'll shower, drink coffee, figure out what to wear, and say a little prayer for you. You look so pretty today. You whisper past my ear. Something inside me, though, shrinks from your words. Oh, I wonder if you think I looked shitty the last time and you can't believe I really hooked myself up. Prisons will make a woman mean, defensive, hostile, and scared. The truth is these people could keep you forever, or more likely, they'll find a way to damage us forever. What have I taken on, I wonder, but do not say, you know, it's easy to love in 6-hour intervals twice a month. Easy to love without bills to pay, responsibilities to share, in an institution rank with bizarre and vicious odors of annihilation. We have ourselves to hold up as light and possibility, and I hold you up and I hold you in, and people tell me I am crazy, crazy to love you across barbed wire and time, but I believe in our love because you struggle with me, lean close to my words, respect our differences, honor my mind, challenge my ideas, think I can make qualitative change in the lives of our people. You take me real motherfucking serious. We talk about your case, the one against the state where some police set you up with drugs and had you thrown in the box. You know convicts are the easiest people to frame. Who believes a convict? Even thinks they're human. But we thank God for the stupidity of police because they couldn't even get that shit right. And you won the case, proving it was a lie. Now you just wonder how much the state will have to pay you. And now I just wonder why any of that is relevant. 10 or 10 million or all the money in the world, you'll still be in prison. And I'll still be in pain. I suppose in a broad political sense, a case like this has serious implications, but sitting here beneath the shadow of a life, the haunting of a future, I'm narrowed and confined to my own sorrow and needs. I love you, mommy, you say, and pull me into a kiss. This type of thing is taking getting used to for me. I never did like public affection, and as much as I need the insistence of that mouth, part of me numbs, knowing we can be seen. These crackers, and I mean the black and Puerto Rican ones too, have unlimited entry into our intimacy. And what does that mean? It means we are their porno. We they 16-minute, 2-minute flash of the kinky and forbidden. We they gyrating bitches in cages and bars. We are their filthy talk on a coffee break. We are a dirty joke. Stop it, I say. Let's get back to our discussion in a minute, mommy. You insist and pull me into your mouth. Your fingers brush against me and I moan. Don't do that. My voice is stunted and separated from the rest of my body, an exposed nerve, pulsating desire. After all, I need you too. Your eyes are on the police now sitting at the desk. He's eating a stank sandwich from the vending machine and we are shielded by a pole. Your hand slides down my belly, pushes my legs apart. In spite of myself, I'm wide open to you. Then we could be two lovers at a restaurant, a movie, a dinner party, an office. This could be sexy exciting, a memory to cherish, a knowing glance, a private grin. This could be a scene from your favorite erotic movie, but instead, this is prison. The sweat is from fear, not lust or raw pleasure. In 20 years, we will not remember these as the hazy, crazy, bold days of youthful sex. We'll remember what we risked. We'll remember that if we were caught, I'd have to visit you through glass for God knows how long. We'll remember that they wanted to teach us a lesson to suppress everything we are and have been and will be. No passion, no hunger, no sensuality, no connection, no bonding, no humanity, no humanity, no humanity, no humanity. You murmur, Mommy, you so sweet. Baby, you feel so good. God damn, I need you. Your fingers are magic brown butterflies. I try to be still, but cannot stop myself. I shift and moan, almost come out my seat, and I'm the rapid waters of the Delaware now. I'm the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Nile. I crave you, need you, thirst you, love you deeply. I love you like Isis loved Osiris, and like Isis, when we are separated, I search this earth, pulling broken pieces of you together, stitching them in blood. I explode unbelievably in the warmth of your hands while the police are still eating. The other visitors and prisoners are still locked in their own discussions, embraces, card games, and arguments. The world is the same, except for me. I've changed. Once again, I've changed.
Smaller, Safer, Fairer. A roadmap to closing Rikers Island is a 53-page report from the de Blasio administration for ending mass incarceration and reducing crime. Any roadmap, by definition, has a goal and lays out milestones on the way to reaching it. If a safer, smaller, fairer correction system is the end goal, it begs the question of if what we have right now is big, dangerous, and fundamentally unfair. What we do know is, for the first time in history, closing Rikers Island is the official policy of the city of New York. But with the shifting political landscape, some content with maintaining the status quo, and even reformers debating the best way forward, should the policy become our city's reality? And how does it get done? This is Unlocked NYC Post-Rikers, a BRIC TV BHeard town hall, presented in partnership with the Vera Institute of Justice. Welcome. Now, you've already met the astonishing Asha Bandele, yes? One more time for Asha. Yep. And in just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to the rest of our panelists. But right now, I'm going to introduce you to them and everyone watching at home, as well as on their screens or wherever people watch things now. So can we get the lights for a second, just so we can look at who's in the house? So there's a statistic that I read recently that 1 in 5 of us has been involved in criminal justice, who has a record, there's some kind of criminal activity that you got dinged for. So 1 in 5 Americans. So just right off the bat, I wondered if that statistic proved true in the room. How many of us have had involvement in the criminal justice system or family members who've been criminally justice involved, yeah? Show of hands, it's a visual medium again. So this is our community. This is who we are. This is an issue that lives where we live and with the people we love, including ourselves. So before we talk to the panelists, I wondered if anyone had a thought or a feeling or something they'd like to share about what closing Rikers would mean for New York City, in your communities, in your home, in yourself. So who wants to break the seal? Is there anybody here who might want to share something about what closing Rikers could mean? Meet me over there. Yeah, right here. Got you.
My name is Felix Guzman. I'm formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless. As one of the 7 formerly incarcerated individuals recommended by community stakeholders, from which 4 are to be on the forming City Council's Commission on Community Reinvestment and the closure of Rikers Island, the importance of closing Rikers Island is to allow people that look like me to have chances to be in community and be able to do productive things, to not actually continue to be throwaways and actually be able to come back into society, not continue the cycle of homelessness, poverty, and all the generational traumas that go along with it. Again, this is a situation where we have to recognize that there's a reason why people continue to find these pathways back to the same places. Mm-hmm. And for me, I am a productive member of the community right now, and it's important that we notice and recognize that with proper supports in place and actually the community resources necessary, our communities can actually just be one healthy community, and we can all thrive together and going forward.
All right. At the risk of anyone trying to top that, I'm looking at you right now. Thank you for sharing that, Felix. Please.
I just want to say that so many people have suffered in Rikers. It serves no purpose to build the human up. It just bring the man down, bring the women down. And it's a warehouse. To me, it's a warehouse, and it's very depressing, and it serves no real purpose, and I'm glad they're closing it.
Another voice. So I'm going to make my way over here. I see you. We got one more.
How you doing, everyone? My name is Sean Kyle. I work for the Vera Institute. I did 24 and a half years for a crime I didn't commit. Closing Rikers Island, if you just stop and think for a second, someone just now was able to avoid Rikers, to go home, to go to their family, to pay their rent, to pick up their child. So closing Rikers means a lot.
So thank you for that to all of you. And like I said, that's just the beginning. We intend to keep the town in our town hall all night. So please continue to dialogue with us. And if you are not in the room, you can still be present. Tweet us. We're hashtagging #BHeard. We'll be going through those all night. There's a room full of people who are going to be aggregating those things, making sure that folks who aren't in the room can take part in the exchange. And of course, you all as well here. So again, thank you for being here. So let's do a little business and let you know, for some of you who haven't met everyone here, there's some great folks we have, starting with Insha Rahman, who's the Director of Strategy and New Initiatives at the Vera Institute of Justice. Thanks for being here, Insha. She helps to incubate new work in the areas of prosecutorial reform, bail, and decarceration. She's also a former public defender and a nationally recognized expert on bail, and developed the bail legislation reforms recently enacted right here in New York State as of January 1, 2020.
That's
Thank
right.
you. All right. Brandon Holmes is the New York City campaign coordinator at JustLeadershipUSA. We're our friends too. Where he oversees city-based advocacy as well as developing campaign strategies. Brandon previously served as an organizer at the New York Civil Liberties Union, as well as being a civil rights organizer for the folks at Vocal New York. Thanks for joining us, Brandon.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Come down the way with me now. I'm going to introduce you to Dan Slepian. He's a 24-year veteran of the NBC News magazine Dateline. Never heard of it, right? He's been his 24-year career has been marked by numerous awards for his in-depth investigations leading to exonerations of the wrongfully convicted, and something that's very much of interest to folks who watch America's News on NBC. Just last year, you might have seen Dan and some groundbreaking work he did heading up their NBC's 2019 Justice for All initiative, where he put America's anchorman in prison. And he was next door to him the entire time as Lester Holt was down there in Louisiana and Angola reporting from the prison. And that initiative brought us the first town hall ever from a maximum security jail. So thank you, prison. I'm going now to Jeffrey Mansfield, who's the design director at Mass Design Group, a Boston-based agency. He's also a John W. Klug Fellow at the Library of Congress, exploring the relationship between architecture, landscape, and power. Good title, right? And at Mass, Jeff also leads the firm's work related to the Incarceration and Justice Design Lab, where they are leveraging architecture to call out spatial injustice. Yes, remind me to ask him about that later. And finally, the woman who needs no introduction, she started the whole thing, Asha Bandele. Thank you for being here tonight. Asha, oh, there's more. Asha is a pioneering writer and social justice activist. Her award-winning memoir, The Prisoner's Wife, chronicles her relationship and marriage to a man serving a 20-year to life sentence in the New York State correctional system. Now, her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Vice, Ebony, and Essence, where she was the features editor for the magazine, and she's also the author of 6 books and a New York Times best-selling author. Thank you for being in the room. That's our people. So now that we have an idea of who's in the room, we just wanted to give you a little sense of who they are. So we have this sort of speed question where we ask for short answers from these very learned people. And one thing that I'd just like to set the temperature of the room with is this quote that I held on to in the course of my research for this night. So, no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. Nelson Mandela. Mm-hmm. So if we're to take this as truth, as anyone should, what can you know from New York City by the state of its jails from your perspective, Insha?
That we treat people as disposable, that we don't think of them as human. If you ever go inside, not only Rikers Island, but there are 3 active city jails called the Boat, the Tombs, and the Brooklyn House of Detention, which is a really sort of neutral name for a terrible, terrible place. You know that none of those places are anywhere where you or anyone you love would want to spend even an hour, let alone days, weeks, months, years.
So Brandon, from your point of entry as a person who's working toward prison abolition, what can we learn about this place we live right now based on the conditions of jails in New York?
Yeah, we can see just from looking inside the jails, and I'd even expand this to prisons across New York State. Mm-hmm. This is where our society has isolated the problems that we don't feel like we have the solutions or the political will to really solve, whether it's homelessness or substance use, mental health crisis. This is where we isolate all of our problems when it seems like the solutions are too complex for our government to take on.
Dan, you took us inside Angola. What can we learn by the way New Yorkers are being held under the conditions now?
I think from a public policy perspective, we have a pathological system where we pay money as taxpayers to make ourselves less safe. When it comes to the people incarcerated, I have found that some of the smartest, most elevated thinkers that I have met have been incarcerated. And so those people have been put in a caging these people and incapacitating these people have put them in a position where they have been forced to change themselves in many ways. And as a result of that, I think that the public has this perverted view of who is in prison, mm-hmm. that it's us and them, when in reality it's we.
So as a designer, Jeffrey, I'm wondering what knowing the conditions and even the physical plant of jails right now, what does that tell us about our nation and the way we're treating people?
Well, I think that when the moment we imprison someone, they are deprived of their humanity. The criminal justice system doesn't stop there. The physical structures of the facilities deprive the person of their right to have experiences of peace, having access to different materiality, textures, sensory experiences, access to physical human contact. All of these forms of normalcy are stripped from a detainee. You're deprived of natural colors, natural air, natural ventilation. And raw sewage is even left in spaces in these facilities, so that they are designed in a way that are intended to deprive a person of their absolute humanity. And that in and of itself is an additional form of sentencing and injustice.
So lastly, you, Asha, what can we tell by seeing?
It's difficult to add to everything that's been said so brilliantly. I look at Rikers Island and prisons and jails across America, and I see like ethnic cleansing. You know, I look at those jails and those prisons as an act of war, and the internment of groups of people, to your point, who we decided we no longer want to deal with, whether it's for the color of their skin or a mental health issue or anything else. It's certainly not because they're not brilliant. But when you consider the conditions, this is an act of war. And I think that we should look at it like America is still in a civil war with itself, given the number of people. It's actually not 1 in 5 people who's experienced the criminal justice system. It's 1 in 2 American adults has a family member who's been in prison. It's fully 50% that we know of who have somebody in prison. This is an act of war on our communities.
A second ago, you just said prison. And during the course of us preparing for this evening, and to meet all of you, we kept going back and forth saying jail and prison and using these terms interchangeably. But there is a reason that jail is called jail and prison is prison. So disabuse me of my switching back and forth between jail and prison.
Sure. So most people just call all of it jail or prison, and it feels interchangeable, but in fact they have 2 distinct roles. So historically, jails have been in most parts of this country, in most states, where people go to either be held pre-trial, meaning they've had bail set that they can't afford, or they are there on violations of parole or probation, or they're serving a sentence that is usually a year or less. Right now in this country, there are 750,000 people behind bars in local jails. Prisons, on the other hand, are where people go, by and large, across this country who are serving felony sentences, who have been convicted and are spending a year or more behind bars. And right now, there are about 1.4 million people in this country in prison. And so those numbers in New York State, there's about 47,000 people in prison right now. And then across New York State, we used to have this time last year about 21,000 people in jail. But because of recent bail reforms, we've actually seen that number shrink by 30% to a little under 15,000 today.
So the difference between jail and prison is a distinction that deserves bearing out.
Yep.
So knowing what we do know about jail, knowing that it is a transitory space to you getting the opportunity to go back home or to go on to something that you're sentenced to later, what's the function of jails now as they are in New York City? Are they functioning in that way as a sort of pass-through, or are people, from the stories that we've been told, getting stuck and it becomes a sentence?
Yeah, I mean, there's countless stories of individuals, and I invoke their names to show how close this really is. Layleen Polanco, Khalif Browder, who even got out of Rikers Island and still, took his own life because of the traumatic experiences that he had while he was in there and the abuse he faced. It's not just people cycling in and coming out, right? It actually, physically, the structure of jail, and especially Rikers Island, the isolation makes it difficult for people to even fight their case in court, to prove their innocence, right? When people are being woken up at 4 a.m. in the morning, handcuffed and shackled and shipped across all the 5 boroughs, right? And, you know, defenders, right? Lawyers who are supporting folks have a heap of cases, right? That people actually being in jail, any pretrial detention, is to see if you will be convicted, right? Or if you will not be convicted, if you're found not guilty. But overwhelmingly, the more time you spend in jail, the lower your chances are of beating that case, right? Of proving your innocence. So there's many people, right? Dan's done a lot of work around wrongful convictions. We've seen the numbers, right? It's alarming, it's egregious how many wrongful convictions happen in New York State. And jail is the #1 cause of that we can't allow people to fight for their freedom at home in the safety of their own community with the resources they need around them to keep them safe.
So if there's anything you've ever wanted to know about jail but were afraid to ask, this is the time to make your way over here and engage with these people while I'm getting in some questions. We welcome starting with you all right now if you have anything that you'd like to talk or question or engage in. But on that tip, I'd like to, no, you were saying something, Asha.
I wanted to see, just also, for feedback. I mean, jails are obviously also a form of social control. Millions more people will pass through America's jails than will pass through its prisons on an annual basis. But I think that it probably shouldn't be left out, that the function of incarceration and mass incarceration, beginning with the first experiment in mass incarceration, which was along the coast of Ghana, right, what we now know as Ghana. This is where it begins. It's where social solitary confinement, everything begins, is to stand up national economies. There's an extraordinary amount of money in the jail industry. And so even if you wipe away some bail, which is excellent, and I don't want to minimize that, or the 30%, you still have, spend a night at night court. Spend a night in night court. There is so much money invested, and that to me is the function that we can't get away from, that these things stand up national economies. There's so much money that's put in it, and people work in them, and they produce items that then go out. I mean, there's just all these ways, beyond even what we know in Ava DuVernay's masterful film, 13th. There are jobs, industries that are dependent on them, and I don't want to lose sight of that. And even with the closing of Rikers, who's going to get all that money to build all the new prisons they're planning to put around New York City?
Oh, we'll get to that.
Okay, that's all I'm saying.
Just in terms of the people who are working in prison, when we were at Angola, Lester was working, this is a former slave plantation, the size of Manhattan. And you drive on to Angola and you realize, oh, this is what it was like, because there are acres and acres and acres of fields of vegetables where black inmates are picking vegetables under the watch of armed guard on horseback, making 2 cents an hour. So today in America, there are hundreds of thousands of people working hard hours for pennies per hour to buy to pay and make products for private companies and the state, only to spend that money on things like toilet paper and women's products from other private companies. So it is in its own, when people talk about prison, and particularly people who are in prison working, feeling like it's slave labor, you understand a little bit more when it's put in context like that.
To that point, Jeffrey, there's a reason why Angola in Louisiana, from an agrarian county state, looks the way that it does. Can you go into that a little bit with us, how prisons reflect the times?
Right. In America, our carceral system, jails and prisons both, are just like any other American institution, like a state hospital, schools for deaf students. And or Native American boarding schools. There were larger efforts at empire building in the United States, and during eras of colonization, Reconstruction, World Wars, urban renewal, neoliberalism, and that sequence of events corrupts the inaugural moral constitution of jails and prisons that were intended to rehabilitate. So as America has seen these changes and industrialization, our jails and prisons have looked like factories. When we said that slavery shall not continue, our prisons looked like plantations. When we expanded westward into new territories, our jails and prisons looked like fortresses. We are now in the age of mass production, and as such, our jails and prisons look like distribution centers and warehouses. So there is a direct relationship that's really implicit in the moral constitution of jails and prisons that has been so profoundly corrupted that they now exist as something that has absolutely nothing to do with rehabilitation or justice or fairness. Instead, they have something to do with driving the economic engine of America. Be it through many prison industries that build our country, that have urbanized them, but also indirectly by disfavoring certain people on the basis of racial class, disability prejudices, and class prejudices. So it is so thoroughly embedded in our country and our nation's values that we need to be able to take a real look at what our values are as a nation and what we want to put forward.
So as part of that city plan that I talked about in the beginning, the smaller, safer, fairer, there's this idea that $265 million in new spending is going to go to efforts intended to keep people out of jail and to support those who have been released. So this is a $265 million carve out in what some are saying is about an $8 billion budget that we're looking at with these borough-based jails. So $265 million, it sounds like a lot of money, but I imagine it can go very quickly if we are making sincere efforts intended to keep people out of jail and support those who have been released. So in your opinion, what does $265 million get you? Where should that money and anything else focused on those goals go?
So I want to start off by saying there's actually no commitment from the city to every year put in a certain amount of money to communities for things like housing and treatment and good schools, parks, all the things that we know actually produce and deliver safety. And so as the city is committed to closing Rikers, which we applaud, we also need the city to actually commit to saying, before we spend $8.7 billion on building 4 new replacement jails so that Rikers can be closed, we're actually investing in our communities first so that we don't need these jails, and so that we can continue over time reducing the number of people who are cycling through the jail and who are spending time behind bars. And so that number, what 265 million a year can get us, is actually not very much if we are not prioritizing that as opposed to just new jail construction, right? And so what are the things that we need to do? Certainly in our communities, we know that permanent affordable housing, which the city has estimated that 1 unit is $38,000 a year. Compare that to how much it costs to keep somebody incarcerated at Rikers for 1 year. That cost is upwards of $700,000. And so we've already talked about what all those costs are. It's mostly personnel. It's unions. There's over 10,000 corrections officers right now employed by the City Department of Correction for a little over 5,000 people who are in jail. That ratio is crazy. Imagine taking some of that money that we're spending on personnel at Rikers Island and investing that first in things like affordable housing, in things like treatment and alternatives to incarceration. So there's investments in communities, which are front and center and I think are key to actually making closing Rikers a reality and having a better justice system overall. And then there are the investments that we need to make in how we do policing to arrest less, because we know that simply arresting people and putting them through the system also doesn't deliver safety, right? And we need to make sure for those folks who we are choosing to prosecute and put through the system, that we're really thinking of alternatives first, that people don't have bail set that they can't afford, that people get access to alternatives to incarceration, really excellent programs, that we really use incarceration as little as we possibly can. Those are the investments that we need to make, and $265 million is not going to be enough. It needs to be an ongoing commitment each and every year as we build these new jails.
So I know you work for an abolitionist organization, and I'm wondering from your perspective, number one, put us in the room of what it means to be an abolitionist in the context of jails in New York City in 2020, and what it is that you would like to see from that standpoint with that money.
Yeah. So, I agree with Insha that $265 million, it doesn't even make a dent or begin to make a dent in addressing the urgent priorities of decarceration, rapid decarceration that will achieve abolition. I do have to push back a little bit in the frame that, an $8.9 billion investment, which is, the price tag on these borough-based jails, we're living in a city today where there are 12 operational city jails. That $8.9 billion would go to demolishing those 12 jails and constructing 4 new facilities that are closer to the courthouses, that are in the boroughs and not isolated on a 400-acre island in the East River. So when we're talking about this $9 billion, right, let's just round up. We're talking about $9 billion. That is an investment to all of the things that Jeffrey was mentioning. People having access to fresh air, to having access to direct sunlight, to getting sewage out of, the amenities that they're using in these facilities. So that is a $9 billion investment in people who have had nothing but divestment their entire lives, that have been isolated to this penal colony that has existed in New York City for over 8 decades, right? Many generations. So we can't think of this as an investment in communities or an investment in jails. No, the people in jails are members of our community, and they deserve an investment in improving the living conditions, the conditions of confinement in the areas that they are currently living in and that they are detained in. At the same time, Inch is absolutely right. Even with attrition and being around 9,000 uniformed corrections officers, with under 5,500 people in detention, operating at almost a 2-to-1 staffing ratio is unacceptable, right? Even this past year, we saw Cuomo approved putting 500 extra cops into our subways, right, to police our youth across New York City, and continue criminalizing these low-level offenses that people should not be in jail for in the first place. So I think the conversation now needs to shift to, yes, we invest in our incarcerated population and our detained population at the same time that we invest in our communities. And the way we do that is by attacking the NYPD budget, attacking the DOC budget, attacking the 5 DA's budgets, to say if crime was reported at all-time lows in 2019 across New York City, if the jail population is the lowest it's been in several decades, there's no reason all of these law enforcement agencies should continue to be allowed to operate with budgets as massive as they are. Between all those agencies I just named, we've got about $14 billion in the New York City budget. If we take half of that, we've got $7 billion to go directly into our communities to keep people out of the justice system, and we've still got the money in the capital plan to invest in improving the conditions of confinement.
So I'm looking at you two down here. You're the storytellers. You're the modern griots. How do we sell this idea that we're going to take $14 billion from law and order and keeping every one of you safe and give half of it to an investment to keep people off of a bad path in the most delicate way? Because it's never, let's keep people off a bad path. Like, how do you sell this idea?
Well, the story, the narrative of the criminal justice system is actually among the most important things in terms of criminal justice policy. I mean, what drives policy today? Emotional, gut, knee-jerk reactions to salacious headlines have created a political force where criminal justice policy is made without any sort of analytical, deliberative, rational analysis that the policies they're passing even work in the first place. So, I'm reminded yesterday, I read the Post, and I saw there was a 20-point swing in political opinion about cash bail. Is that any surprise that the Post has run front page covers about the 2 or 3, 4 people who have gotten out? and committed a crime. You know, we don't take a pharmaceutical drug off of the market because 3 people die when it helps 1 million people. So what we need to do is inject a little common sense into this, I think, and recognize, and that's why I said pathological before. You know, we were saying before, you know, there's planes that take off every single day and they land safely and you never hear about it. The ones you hear about are the ones that crash. So I think the narrative that we're telling is incredibly important, because if you had a front page cover of the Post 3 days a week about Sean Kyler, who did 24 years and is now working at Vera, my friend Kenyatta Hughes, who did 25 years and got out and performed at Carnegie Hall that night, Lawrence Bartley, who works at the Marshall Project after 27 years in prison and now does makes a magazine called News Inside for the incarcerated population. If those were the stories that people would be hearing, it might be a little bit easier to get the money.
Or if they read stories
I'd
like The
rather not
Prisoner's
always
Wife.
be the last person, because so much brilliance is already
Listen,
said that
jump
one
in.
can
All
occur.
of you should
But
jump in as well
I
and
tried,
text
but
us.
then other people got a chance before me, but that's all right. I'm not hurt. So I want to just say, just in terms of the things that we need is, you know, we need something that directly addresses trauma disruption that has occurred because of, you know, 50 years of deciding to separate families and destroy communities. And so that, I just want to name that Patrice Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, would always say when we were on book tour that therapy has to be part of the reparations plan. And we just don't get it. And so I want to name that. And I think that storytelling is monumentally important. I've made my living doing it. I also know that stories have been out there. The Innocence Project does a great job in putting some of the stories out there. But I think that what's not as out there, despite the large sort of nonprofit structure we have, is something that I've talked with Sekou Odinga about and other Black Panthers, and that's real direct on the ground, person-to-person community organizing. Let me say that a little bit more. My stepson was murdered August 19th of 2015. And people were convicted and they went to prison. But when I sit with the woman I call my co-wife, we both have children by the same man, we're very close, and asked her what justice meant to her, it wasn't prison, right? That was the only response she had. And so I think that in doing direct organizing, we actually have to be face-to-face with people who are not in this room, who are not going to come to a community meeting. We got to get off the pulpit and go into the pews and talk with people about what justice is. You know, 150 years ago, prison was the reform, but we don't know to even think about what's the reform now. I'd like to see some money put into what's the reform now. If we're not going to cut people's heads off in the public square, and we're not going to, you know, we did prisons, now what? What are we going to do now? And so some of the money should go into that and putting that out there in very public ways, another way of thinking to give people actual ideas to hold on to and then retrain them. Because I'll tell you one thing, we're not going to stop prisons until we get Black women to join us, and Black women are dependent on the prison system. We're overrepresented, so are Black men, not just inside, but working in night court, working in bail, working in prisons. We're overrepresented, which means we're dependent on that system. And until we offer another way for people to pay their families, it's not going to end.
So in the service of getting out of the pulpit and into the pews, we've invited someone here who has lived experience from being in the system to someone who's a system changer. I'm going to give you Marvin Mayfield.
Yes, yes.
A white man leaves a party late at night and he's walking toward the subway. He looks around him and he sees, well, you know, this neighborhood looks a little dangerous. He feels a little uncomfortable. He walks along and around the curve comes a police car. White man says, oh, thank God, it's the police. Black man leaves the same party and he's walking toward the subway, his way home. He sees that police car turn the corner and he says, oh shit, it's the cops. That's the story of two tales, of two cities, of two ways of that our communities are policed. Before I was 12 years old, I knew what Rikers Island was. I heard all the stories. It was almost a rite of passage for the men in my community to go to jail. It wasn't unheard of. It wasn't surprising. It's what it was. One night, I was stopped by the police. I was pulled over. I was stopped by the police, pulled over onto their car, searched, handcuffed, beaten, taken into custody. I didn't even know what I was charged with until I got into arraignment. When I got to arraignment, the judge gave me a $10,000 bail. It might have been $10 million bail. I didn't have it to get out. I ended up in Rikers Island. And no matter what stories you've heard, no matter what you've seen on TV, nothing could prepare you for the realities of Rikers Island. The first thing was the smell. Urine, feces, unwashed bodies, all mingling together. It was overpowering. The sound and the roar from these cages was deafening and overpowering. I remember the CO led me into a cell that was overpacked like a train car at rush hour, and he just pushed me in. And it didn't take a few more minutes until I had my first assault. I was assaulted the first time. And I was robbed from my shoes. There was no CO to come to the rescue. Nobody cared. Nobody said a word. I stayed in that condition for 3 days, going back and forth from filthy cell to filthy cell until they got me to a housing unit. Once I got to the housing unit, I could hear the roar of the housing unit before I even went in. And when I got in, I was assaulted again. This time my leg was broken. This is something that repeated itself for 11 months. 11 months of torture, 11 months of degradation, 11 months of humiliation, 11 months of torture. Why? Because I couldn't pay my way out. I found out that I was charged with a burglary, nonviolent. Burglary in the 3rd degree is what they were charging me with. I was coming home from a party. I know where I was. For 11 months, I remember when the CEOs would come in to Rikers Island. They would come into our housing units, and they would do what they call a shakedown. And God help you if you got in the way. And this is the position you should assume, because I still have the scars in my head when their sticks came down crashing on my head because I didn't move out of the way fast enough. I remember being in a cell so hot that the walls sweat that I had to lay on the floor to suck air out of a little crack in the ground so that I wouldn't pass out and suffocate. And my fears were not unwarranted. Other men died because of that heat that summer. After 11 months, going on and on like this, I went back and forth to court many times to see no one, getting chained up at 4 in.the morning from wrist and ankle and being put on a chain gang in a buses and herded like cattle to different courts all over the city. For 11 months, I dealt with this. And at the end of 11 months, they told me, okay. Never once did they show me any evidence. Never once did I get any discovery materials. Never once did I know the charges against me. And after 11 months, they said, okay, if you plead guilty, we'll let you go home. So after all the blows, after all the hurt, the biggest blow was pleading guilty just to stop the suffering. Rikers Island, it was a place of torture for a long time. And there were a lot of lives lost, a lot of hurt, a lot of apathy, negligence, a lot of brutality. I faced it firsthand. No one should have to stay in jail just because they can't pay their way out. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you to Marvin Mayfield for sharing your truth with us. We really appreciate you being here tonight and sharing with us. Thank you. Again, for Marvin, please. So I just got a question that was handed to me. Someone wants to know, are prisons, jails, and the police department responsible for generating revenue? And how does that drive their purpose? Anyone have an answer for that?
I mean, prisons, to be sure, you know, we certainly saw that in 13th, have industries associated with them, or to which you were speaking of, Dan, the private industries that are operate within prisons, but also, you know, municipalities, right? So you have firefighters who come from prisons and risk their lives. Some of the worst oil spills, those have been prisoners who have done that. But jails generate income, right? They take tax levy dollars and, you know, hire people. So the more people you determine who can be in jail, the more taxes you can collect to pay those salaries. There's an industry associated with it. There's a huge amount. I mean, and again, it's not just the people who work in the facility. It's the people who make money because of the vending machines. The people who make money because of the uniforms that are made. The people who operate whatever buses go up there, right? There's so many, you know, there's so many industries that are tied up to jails and prisons that it's, that's why I said these stand up national economies. It's not something small. It's not just Victoria's Secret's making bras or whatever. I mean, that's horrible enough. But it is huge and it's widespread. So yes, they generate income and they take our tax dollars to do a goodly portion of that.
So one of the most important things for people in prison is to be in touch with their families.
Yes.
Is to speak to their loved ones, to touch them, to hug them, to see them. Securus Technologies.
Right.
I just learned this, you know, I was just reading something the other day. They're in more than 2,000 correctional facilities in this country where they have video visitation, where they charge $1 a minute. And in the majority of the contracts that they've negotiated, they have gotten rid of in-person visitation.
That's right.
So every single time, so they've monetized human contact. Phone calls, pictures, emails. So that, and that's just one company. Yet, right now in Mississippi, where 19 people incarcerated have died in the past 6 weeks because of riots that are happening, they're down 1,000 officers, and the starting salary for an officer is $24,000 a year. Yet these companies are making hundreds of millions of dollars from the people who can afford it the least. How does that make sense?
But Dan, you know what? There's also the people who do all the ankle monitoring devices for federal prisoners. That was part of the fake First Step Act. You know?
They'll have the folks who have the ankle
every
monitor
federal prisoner coming out now has to wear an ankle monitoring bracelet. That was the deal that was negotiated with your man in the White House. You know, that it was called a criminal justice reform.
So I want to name something else, which is why we have so many more jails and prisons than we do permanent affordable housing or treatment options in the community, is that jails and prisons are actually very easy to build. Counties get very low interest loans to build them, sometimes from the federal government. Jails get rebuilt on average about every 30 years. There's nothing else that we build every 30 years. Hospitals get used 24 hours a day, much in the way that jails do. Schools get used for several hours a day, but there is no other industry in which we say every 30 years we're gonna rebuild this hospital. And yet for jails, we do this all the time. And what we know from the statistics is that if you build a jail, it will get filled because this is a very local business, right? The police know how many jail cells are there to fill, and arrests really are dependent on that. Whether judges set bail or incarcerate people is dependent on that. And what we've seen is when we choose to not build a new jail, when we actually take beds offline and we say live within your means, counties are able to do that. And they're able to do that without compromising public safety. We've seen this time and time again, but in this country we've set it up so that counties and states can actually get low interest loans to build these kinds of facilities. And the other thing we need to look at is like, what's the incentive there? We have a country where we work on sort of, private interests and lobbying. And for example, we've talked about the bail bond industry and paying bail. We know right now that the bail bond industry is waging a fight and giving money to local law enforcement and paying for Facebook ads to fight back against bail reform here in New York. And we know that in places like Louisiana, the bail bond industry gives money to judges races and to prosecutor races. So those are all the different ways in which there is a profit incentive outside of the jails themselves, the prisons themselves, but in how they're built and how they're run.
And not to mention all the people that we're keeping in prison that we're spending money on as taxpayers that are no longer a threat to society in the least bit. I met a guy in Angola. His name is Sammy Robinson. He was locked up in 1953 when he was 17 years old.
The longest serving person in Angola currently.
He was 83 when I met him. He had been in 66 years or whatever it is. And I remember taking a picture of his hands. And they were just wrinkled, worn, old hands. He had the face of a guy who did a life in prison. And he was a threat to no one. He died 3 weeks ago, a couple months ago. He passed away. But I met Henry Montgomery, whose name is on a Supreme Court law that outlaws, that says juvenile life without parole is unconstitutional. His name is on that law. He was 17 years old when he was locked up in 1963 before JFK was assassinated. He's still in prison today and was denied parole. The 3 people on that panel voted unanimous. 2 voted to let him out. It had to be unanimous. 1 guy said he can't get out. He's still in prison. We know that people who are over 70 who get out have basically a 0% recidivism rate. Yeah. Why are we keeping all these people in prison and paying for them to be there? It doesn't make sense.
We also know that just like America is aging, our prison population is aging, and there are build-outs for assisted living that are now baked into the new prisons that are coming online. But looking at the business of these buildings, Jeffrey, I know that you are involved in justice architecture. How good is business?
So we are a unique organization. We're a nonprofit organization. So our mission is to serve the public good. And we take from that framework, we are very cautious about how we engage with any kind of work. And our number one priority is that people who are closest and most intimately impacted by the system are the people who are closest to the solution, to whatever the new system should look like. So in talking about things like funding that's available to support the re-envisioning of prisons and jails, or to support community investments, or to support enhancements and the conditions of confinement, that money has to be figured out how to be redistributed among the people who are most intimately impacted by the system by using the design process to leverage those opportunities to get input from people who should be at the table and to have them right there participating in the process, and to make sure that it's economically viable, and to make sure that you can develop the solutions in order to make better conditions so that our society is one that's better for all. So through this process, right now, the prison industry is traditionally unjust. And yes, the architecture of it is also unjust, because people are just looking at building things rapidly, and they just copy the same exact prison design in many locations. It's pervasive. So that is the business model of prison design, and that model is broken. So our intention is to disrupt that model and make sure that we have an inclusive design process early, before an RFP even comes out, to make sure that we have the right principles, the right economic mechanisms, the right people all participating in this process.
So looking at the principles and the reasoning and the people who make it happen, recently I had the opportunity to meet with the New York City chapter of the American Institute of Architects and their Justice Committee, where I got to ask them some questions about building prisons and jails and about what the possibilities for these 4 proposed borough jails that New York City is endeavoring to build may be in New York City post-Rikers. So please have a look. There was always someone saying, it's just the building. It's not the building's fault. Why do we have to close Rikers down? If we need reform and things are bad, start with the people. The building didn't hurt anyone, but are they right?
Everything that we do when we design these facilities is to try to improve conditions of confinement and outcomes.
The old idea of a jail, lock them up, throw away the key, etc., that's what's obsolete. The new idea of a jail is that it's a community benefit.
No new jails! No new jails! I'm here speaking on behalf of No New Jails NYC.
But is it truly a community benefit if the community says no?
We're a coalition that's calling for the immediate closure of Rikers Island.
This land use proposal to build the tallest skyscraper jails in the world would literally cement a future of incarceration for New York City. Rikers itself was opened as a reform, and there is no reason to believe that this latest attempt to build a humane cage will turn out differently than each other time it has failed. We already know that modern jails and residential neighborhoods are also torture chambers. Look at MDC without heat in the winter. Look at the Brooklyn Detention Center. Look at the Tombs. The entire system has got to go, but this jail expansion plan would only entrench it.
In January of 2020, No New Jail sent a letter to firms who'd expressed interest in designing the proposed new borough-based jails, urging them to rethink their participation. It read in part, "Sound ethical environmental design and construction calls for closing Rikers without building new jails, because jails are tools of racist violence."
I don't think most people think of people who, design cages as being people that are trying to be empathetic about that process, right?
Have you ever been called a person who designs cages? Has that ever been a charge leveled at you?
Right here in a letter from No New Jails.
Yeah.
Saying don't be part of this process.
A good building will not turn a quote-unquote bad person into a good person.
Mm-hmm.
But a bad building will make everybody worse.
So thank you to the folks at the New York City chapter of the American Institute of Architects Justice Committee. Hugh Lester is here. Thank you for your part in being in that video. So no building is going to make a bad person good, but a bad building will make everybody worse. Can we build our way out of this?
I think that at the core of that question, it is architectural and moral, that it's an architectural and moral quandary. So we all agree that there needs to be a different and better system that needs to be more humane. But the key question here for us as designers is that we have to think about how we're designing the obsolescence of the current system. So how can, in this process, how can we expedite that aim of obsolescence? How can we incorporate and develop a groundswell of activism to expedite that process? So we see design and architecture as an act of resistance. It's a tool of activism, and it also as a process of overall and restorative healing. So to answer that question, you need to be able to look at the process as one that's not just about improving the conditions of confinement. I mean, of course, that is one aspect of what's needed, but we need to look at how the process can develop a collective healing from this destructive legacy of mass incarceration.
Can I just say that this is not a theoretical argument. This is something that's actually happening. I was honored to join Vera a year and a half ago to go to Germany and Norway to tour prisons there. And it was incredible what they're doing. I mean, the prevailing wisdom is really kind of a simple thought. It's called human dignity. And the way it actually manifested itself to me, when it really hit me, the power of that, I'll never forget. I was standing in one of their cells in which they have phones and refrigerators and doors that will close.
Not at $1 a minute, folks.
Not at $1 a minute of phones.
No.
We were taking it to her, and Deanna Hoskins, who is the president of Just Leadership, was one of the last people to leave. And I have a photograph of this. And she was standing against the wall, and light was coming onto her face. And she just stood there for like a minute. And I stood with her in silence. And she left, and I was like, what were you thinking about? She said, if I had a window like that when I was locked up, everything would have been different. And that's when it hit me, the power of what he's doing.
I can't minimize that experience or what you were saying earlier, Brandon, about just the despicable conditions. But I'm haunted by what Marvin said about laying in the floor to get a little piece of air. You know, so in Africa there were no prisons until the Portuguese, you know, it began building them, and they built them first as what they said were fortresses, but of course, and they still call them castles. That's what the first prisons actually look like here. Eastern facility in Pennsylvania actually looks like those dungeons there. And the way they would punish people who resisted, either women who refused to be raped, or men who, or children who pushed back against the Europeans who were capturing them, and those people were called criminals too, by the way. They were called criminals. Was that they put them in a cell with no light, where there was no air, and they suffocated to death in the heat. And I think about that a lot. And I went back twice in 1 year to make sure I saw what I really saw, because it wasn't 2 of them, it was 47 along that thing called the Gold Coast. I don't think there's any reforming something that begins like that. I think that when something starts in evil, there's no getting out of it. And I feel like when we talk about reforming the criminal justice system, we always talk about it from the most infirm point of view. We talk about the Ted Bundys among us, and that's the rarity. Right. I'm a prison abolitionist, and I'd like to talk about the possibility of what we could have if we didn't invest in prison at all. What would our schools look like? What could we imagine a country that has almost no crime? What do they have in place?
Does no prisons equal no crime?
Well, we know that prisons and crime don't go together, or else like Dick Cheney would go to prison for like killing 1 million people in an Iraq war and line us into that. So we know there's not a correlation with even the worst crime. He's a mass murderer, right? So we know that that's not the correlation. So I'm just trying to figure out, it's almost like if you want to know how to enjoy life, you know, we tend to study people who are depressed. Let's study people who are happy, right? So I want to look at a country where you don't have all these prisons, where you don't have that. What is in place? Are people eating regularly? Is the nutrition good? Are the schools good? Do people function in community? There's all these kinds of things that can be present. Mm-hmm. And I want to begin from that point of view, because that's the way you begin to abolish prisons. You put the good in the place, right? You don't, it's like when they tell people when you're exercising or dieting, right? Don't think about what you're taking out, think about what you're putting in. You're eating maybe it is fewer Oreos, but it's a whole lot more lentils, or whatever it is that you like. My curry lentils are great. But whatever it is you're putting in place, right? Yeah. And so I want us to think about it like that way. There's actually a difference between punishments and accountability. And I believe in accountability. But I have not seen where punishment has ever gotten anything right. And I say that as a single parent who never punished my child, never hit her. If you ask her what I ever did, it was that I took her phone away for an hour. This is the daughter of a man whose father was in prison, whose brother was a drug seller, and who was murdered in the street in cold blood. And she's a Dean's level student at Columbia University. So I don't believe that punishment works. I believe love and reward and holding close and holding tight and building community, which is what she's had, works. And if we could try that a little bit more outside of here, we might do better as a nation.
So I hear, thank you. I hear the claps and the support for that. You don't believe that punishment works, but I'm wondering, just if you search yourselves and the people who you know outside of the room who might not be sitting next to you right now, if we really are walking the walk and not believing that punishment works. Because we keep replicating this idea of punishment and building castles and now skyscrapers to the idea of punishment. But I want to just talk to you, relay a conversation that I had recently. I got on the phone with Bernie Carrick about 2 weeks ago in anticipation of this evening. He expressed his regret at not being here tonight, but he's giving a speech at CPAC. But in the course of our, true story, but in the course of our conversation, he said to me, I woke up this morning in a Trump hotel in Washington, D.C. And it's phenomenal. But imagine if it was a horrible hotel and the whole place was just a dump. If the sheets were dirty, if housekeeping was rude, if the food was horrible. This hotel would go down the drain. And if they demolished it and built a hotel in its place here and hired the same cook, the same housekeeping staff, and the same folks who did the laundry in a sparkling new building, all of the same problems would be present. Demolishing this hotel wouldn't make it better if you have all the same folks in. So he, by extension, is saying you can do whatever you want with Rikers. When I was in charge, we had programs and support that made historically low violence happen in the period when Giuliani and he were working in tandem.
He's still lying.
So
He's a liar.
this is what he's saying. And I'm listening to you, Dan, talk about the trip that was made over to Norway and looking at these buildings that have light coming in, that respect humanity, and seeing you be there as an ambassador to find out what we can do for the better from our city. And I'm thinking about Bernie Carrick telling me, no one has ever asked me for my opinion or what I did in Rikers to make it right. When I had folks coming from other parts of the world saying, how did you transform Rikers, the most infamous, notorious, deadliest jail in the world? They were coming, beating a path to me, finding out what I did. But not one single reformer has ever asked me how we did it. Is that a mistake? Who's not at the table?
Why does he get this much space? That's just a lie. All of that is nonsense. That's not true. So many people died under his watch and under Giuliani's watch. To give him that kind of space, I find like insane. It's a lie.
And
There's so many lies that are told. I wouldn't give him that
to.
space, just personally. It's offensive.
Yeah.
It's offensive. It's not true.
Well,
and I wouldn't repeat it.
What we can actually look at through history
That's what I'm
is
saying, his
there
record.
were 3 past attempts to also close Rikers, which each failed, and one of them being during his tenure. And all the attempts at reform, we can still date in 2019 over 5 people that I know the names of who died on Rikers Island. So clearly none of that work, none of that legacy, that supposed legacy, has actually led us to the path that we
Children
need
were
to
being
be.
tied to beds and beaten by guards on his watch and Giuliani's watch. He's an animal, and we don't even deserve to say his name. That's my opinion.
So to the broader question then, who is not at the table who maybe should be? We heard from Marvin and thinking about centering people who have a lived experience and what Jeffrey was saying earlier
What
about
table?
folks who are closest.
What table? Yeah. Is it the Senate table in Albany? It's the way that these laws and policies made are politicians who are responding to public fear and racism in large part. That's who's at the table. So, I don't know how you even get. If we want to talk about reform, we should talk about things that you could do today. Today, there could be. Every governor in this country can say to their Department of Corrections, from now on,
Right.
every corrections officer is going to call the incarcerated men by their names, not by their numbers. That's something that could happen today. That's a step in the right direction. To make sure that someone who is having a problem isn't locked down, but is given help, is given the right resources. That's a step in the right direction. To think of these people who are locked up is not just to keep, forget about them for your paycheck so you go home safe, but to make sure they don't come back to prison. We demand accountability as a society for that one person. For those of us in the room that are old enough of a certain age to remember, for those of us who aren't, I'm envious of you, but in 1988, when George Bush ran against Michael Dukakis, he ran this ad about Willie Horton, who got out of a furlough program in Massachusetts where Dukakis was the governor, and went on to assault someone and sexually assault a woman. And that was all over the place. It was one of the biggest ads. A lot of people think it cost Dukakis the election. And the parole rates around the country dropped after that.
Yeah.
And what wasn't reported is that furlough program had a 99% success rate. And it closed after this. But what we do as a society is we demand accountability of why did Willie Horton do that? But what we don't ask is why more than half the people who get out are rearrested within the next 5 years. What are we doing in the system that's causing that to happen? We don't demand accountability for that. We think if we just throw people up and lock away the key, that they're going to come out and they're going to be productive members of society. When we deny housing, we deny food stamps, we deny school. They can't necessarily live in certain neighborhoods. What do we think is going to happen? That's why I say it's pathological, because it doesn't make sense.
When you asked about that table of power, I'm saying who's missing from the table? Where's the table? Is it upstate? Is it downstate? Is it in this room? Is it in our boroughs? I'm looking at a landscape and watching the clock that in 2021, we're going to have a new mayor in New York City, 5 new borough presidents, 36 members of the city council are exiting, and there's going to be a new comptroller as well. So a sea change. What does that mean for who's at the table or where the table is for where we sit in New York City if we want New York City post-Rikers? Because by some definition, Mayor Blue, excuse me. He keeps coming back, right?
Basically.
By some definition, Mayor de Blasio was dragged kicking and screaming by some accounts into this promise by 2026 when he's going to be somewhere else. So looking at that landscape, what do we need to do collectively to make sure that this stays at the front of the legislative calendar as well as the front of our minds in making sure that justice is achieved and not at the expense of putting people on that cycle that you talked about?
I'd say there's, to address your question of who's at the table, there's 3 major buckets, right? One is JustLeadershipUSA, the organization that I work for. Our entire mission is centering people who have lived experience, who have been incarcerated, to be the decision makers and the people presenting solutions for how we work our way out of these issues. And part of that was in organizing the Close Rikers campaign, right, from our founder and former president, Glenn Martin, approaching de Blasio, who told him in 2016, closing Rikers is a lofty ideal. It's never going to happen. I agree that there's some problems, but we got to think of another way. To then establishing the Lippman Commission as an independent research body to develop the answer to the question, do we close Rikers or do we try to fix it? And ultimately that commission came out saying, no, it's got to go. And that started with formerly incarcerated leaders, survivors of Rikers Island to be specific, attending and mobilizing at those hearings and saying, it doesn't matter what you ask this community here in this corner of Queens or what you ask these folks over here in Staten Island, listen to us, because we will show up at every single one of these meetings. We will continue to show up for years down the line until 3 years from today, in 2019, we're going to get a commitment from City Council and from this mayor who told us it was impossible to close Rikers. And when he's gone, this is still our city. and we will still be the ones who are leading this and shepherding us towards the path of closure. And the way that we were successful in that is because service providers, reentry organizations, public defenders, all of these groups, faith leaders, said, yes, we will listen to formerly incarcerated leaders and we will follow their leadership in how we solve this issue. And ultimately, that vote that happened in October 2019 never would have happened if New York City at large did not commit to listening to the experience of survivors of Rikers Island and how we close Rikers Island. And moving forward, the question is about, as Intra and I were saying before, it's about those investments now, right? Now that there's been a plan that's put down on paper, now that there's a plan that council has committed to, it's been voted on, passed, we need to be the oversight body. All of us in this room need to make sure that whoever we vote for, whoever takes those positions, that those are people who are continuing to listen to the leaders that we've established in our communities and that we've raised up and said, we're following these folks because they've had the experience and they know what it's like on the inside. And at the same time, we can reinforce their demands for the investments we need in our neighborhoods and show that we respect and honor them as our neighbors, right? That even when someone is not physically in our neighborhood, the things that they believe in, the things that they value, are values that we should reflect in our city's budget. Right now, we're not at that point. And in order to actually accomplish the goal of closure by 2026, we have to be doing both of those things at the same time.
Marvin, I'd like to say, I think that I really do believe that we need to have some kind of discussion with people who are economically dependent on jails, but who don't necessarily love them. I went up to prisons enough in my life to know that there were plenty of people who worked in them who hated that job. It's kind of like, forgive me for saying it like this, it's like the Denny's of jobs. It's not a place you go to, it's a place you end up. And people there's limited choices. Right. Certainly in upstate prisons, but also here, you might take a test for anything and that's what you get. And so I think that until we're having a discussion about what else would you rather be doing, and until you provide another way for people to be able to take care of their families, we're going to get resistance from the people who are in the unions and who are on the ground, unless you give them another job and another way to live, because people are going to act out of self-interest. Working in magazines taught me that. I wanted to say whatever I wanted about political prisoners and anything else, but I had to put Denzel on the cover in a certain way. I had to tell you know what I'm saying? So it's just like, you got to give some reason for people to shift. And I don't think we're going to win until we have some of the people who are in there saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore.
Dan. Yeah, I just want to talk about the corrections officers for a second. But, I've been volunteering at Sing Sing for about 6 or 7 years with a group of guys, Sean included. We made a program called Voices from Within, and it was about gun violence. And I've gotten to meet many of the officers, and I've got to say, and I know that you don't think all officers are bad. I'm not suggesting you're saying that, but I've met really good people who are trying to do good work under horrible circumstances. And I just think we should recognize the flip side of this argument, which is how difficult reform is for reasons like this. I'll just give you one example. We know the antidote to incarceration and crime is education. We know that people who are educated have less instances of committing crime, right? Yet, when you provide education in prisons, the few prisons that do have good, robust education programs, college level, master level courses, you have corrections officers that are sitting there all night saying, I can't afford college for my kid. And these people who killed people are getting education. So that's a real thing, right? And there's answers to that. There's policy answers to that. Once you talk it out, people understand the different arguments. But as a headline, as a concept, it's really, it's a hard thing to get around.
So in our last 3 minutes in this forum together, and I encourage all of you to continue to use that hashtag BHeard and continue this dialogue through this evening. But we posited this evening to be about New York City post-Rikers. And New York City post-Rikers is a state of being, and it's also a state of mind. And I want each of you to have some time with respect to that, to see how you envision us changing not just the physical plant, but the way that we relate to each other and people who are our people who are coming home, and what that's going to mean post-Rikers for all of us. So Asha, there was something I read from you where you said at 3 years old, your daughter said, "Can we not tell people that daddy is in prison anymore?" And to think of a 3-year-old having some kind of idea that that is not something to be shared, that she was learned very well at a very early age. So if you could start and everyone else fall in as you do on changing the culture that leads a 3-year-old to know that this isn't something we share.
Now I hate being the first person. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Why can't I be number 3? I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this correctly, Robert. I believe in compassionate. I'll say this. When I was a little girl, my family is from South Bend, Indiana, which is also why I know Buttigieg ain't shit. But my family is from South Bend, Indiana. Little plug. And we were the Andersons and the Dunsons and the Bradleys. And next door to my uncle's house was the Johnson family. I was like big, like maybe 10 or 12 before I realized that Mr. and Mrs. Johnson weren't my actual blood family. That's how we lived. And I could walk from Minor Street to Francis Street, which involved some twists and turns, when I was 6 years old with my little sister. And there was no fear. Everyone knew us on that way. And I'm not a baby anymore, but I'm also not so old. Like, it is possible to build communities. People can tell you that in some of the projects that exist right now. People look out for one another. We care. I live in a building where I literally don't know anybody's name, like not one neighbor. And I go to some of the little functions to try to build community, but I live right over here on Ashland Place. I do not know one neighbor. That was never true before. And so one thing that I would love to see is a way for us to know each other and see each other as interconnected and reliant upon each other for life and for joy and for compassion, and that we are interdependent. I truly want a world without barriers and walls.
Barriers and walls. So you were last and you were first, and now you are last. We've run up against our time tonight on this forum, but I just want to take our last few seconds. It was all good. I want to take our last few seconds to say thank you to our partners at the Vera Institute. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to our panelists. The conversation will always continue. As I said, you can always hashtag BHeardUs and continue the dialogue going in this room and outside and with your friends and neighbors and the real folks in the community. So again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Have a great evening, everyone.